Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. This is kind of weird because we're going to be interviewing each other. So Noriko's going to start and ask me some difficult questions.
Well, anyway, before we start, we'd like to make a remark that we have decided to swap the order of the pieces. After we rehearsed, we've decided that it should really be the Rachmaninov in the second half rather than in the first. So we're going to start the concert with Debussy, and then we'll carry on with Rite of Spring, Stravinsky, and then interval. Then we're going to play Rachmaninov.
Incredible pieces, all three of them.
Yes. Well, I think, Peter, if you could sort of say why we decided to swap the order before we...
Right. Well, I think there are various reasons for that. First of all, I think Debussy and Stravinsky are closer than Debussy and Rachmaninov, although they're all pretty close to each other, certainly in terms of dates. And of course, Stravinsky was a Russian who emigrated to Paris at that stage, at any rate, before he wrote the three great ballets, The Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. And there is a story which we were talking about earlier on today, that when Stravinsky was in the habit of writing his orchestral works for piano first, and then orchestrating them later, something that Rachmaninoff did quite a lot as well. He wrote a piano duet version of this unbelievable vision he had of a Rite of Spring, worshipping the god of spring in ancient Russia. He invited Debussy round, who was his friend, to his apartment in Paris and asked him to play the duet version on one piano, as opposed to two, which we're using, which is a lot easier. Debussy, Stravinsky himself said later that Debussy sight read it flawlessly and was far more accurate than he was himself. Which, when you consider the nature of the music and the unbelievable explosion of new ideas and incredibly difficult rhythms and so on, is an extraordinary thing. Debussy was an unbelievable talent, and I think he towered over the whole 20th century in terms of the influence he had, in particular in Paris, on Ravel and on Stravinsky and the whole of that wonderful explosion of ballet culture that happened then through Sergei Diaghilev. And then later on there was Fauré and there was Blanc and many other great French composers, and eventually Olivier Messiaen, who owed more to Stravinsky than just about anybody else. I mean, he owed it to. And so the idea of putting them together was first because of that, and secondly because the Rachmaninoff is longer.
Well, yes.
The Rachmaninoff is in fact longer than the Rite of Spring, even though the Rite of Spring seems so immense. It isn't particularly long, and the Rachmaninoff is not. Neither is the Rachmaninoff that long, but it's more of a substantial length for a second half, and so it just seemed the obvious thing to do, really, once we'd started to rehearse it. And the styles go together in that order so well. So that's what we're doing. Anyone who's only coming for the Rite of Spring, who arrives at the interval, will be very disappointed.
That is true. But then somehow the writing that Rachmaninoff does is just, he just uses the keyboard really to the full, and every possibility is there, and how he orchestrates two pianos, if you like. It's just genius, isn't it? And in that respect, that the two pianos are going to ring in certain way when you play Rachmaninoff, and then also this lyrical melody, tearful and also very dark, this piece. Yes. And somehow you can't really top that. After that piece, we can't somehow go to Stravinsky. But somehow, I was just thinking curiously, all three pieces have got really quite dark feature and dark themes. All three, don't you think?
Well, that period was, of course, the period of the First World War and its aftermath. And most artists, never mind composers, were very pessimistic about the future. And I think that was certainly true of Debussy, as reflected in the second movement, particularly of En Blanc et Noir. But of course, dissonance of the Rite of Spring expresses something of that as well. I have to say, I think that it's probably, I love all music from the whole history of music, but this period of the 20th century was always my favourite when I was young. And I kind of emerged into being a professional musician through this very area, which of course included Russia as well, but it was primarily centred around Paris. And for me, it's like the whole of music since Bach until the First World War was dominated by Germany. I know there was Berlioz and there was Saint-Saëns and one or two, Chopin of course, one or two non-German composers, but most of them were Germanic. And came the First World War, which Germany started, by the way, but that's nothing to do with it. After the First World War, the whole explosion of new ideas, this isn't really about dissonance. It's not about it becoming revolutionary. It's about it becoming more international. Influences from America and from Hungary and very obviously from Russia, but also France, you know, and many other places. They suddenly had this immense explosion of unbelievably geniuses, incredible music, and it all got interlinked. And I think maybe the Stravinsky period in Paris was perhaps the most fruitful of all. That period in the, what would it be, starting in 1910 or so, going right through to the end of Ravel's life, which would be in the 30s. That was an unbelievable period, productive period. And perhaps it is linked with social history and the World War and everything else. But for me, it's just, you know, we're not even mentioned Shostakovich and Prokofiev and Ravel and many other composers who were so different to each other and had so many things to add. Bartók, there's another one, you know, and so it goes on like that. I think it's fantastic, really. Yeah. And when we were rehearsing this afternoon, I got really very emotional because of that, because it brings the memory back of why I wanted to be a musician in the first place. It's very largely because of this period.
Yes. Well, I hear that you used to play Rite of Spring in the orchestra.
Well, I did once.
Not the piano.
No. You want me to talk about that?
Why not? I don't think very many people have done both.
Maybe not, no. Well, it goes back to the early 70s, and I was a professional percussion player at that time, as well as being a pianist. It wasn't that I swapped one for the other. The piano was there all the time. But one of the dates I did, as a fairly busy percussion player, in 1974, was as an extra with the Merseyside Youth Orchestra, which of course is based in Liverpool. And it was when I was 19 or 20, and it was the first time the Rite of Spring had ever been conducted by an individual called Simon Rattle. That was his first performance of a piece he was associated with for years. And I was the timpanist in that, and I have to say it's one of the greatest experiences I've ever had in a concert hall. And the timpani part, along with Walton's First Symphony, is the greatest timpani part ever written, I think. If you accept that all the Beethoven symphonies are, he was the god of timpani writing, but after that, the 20th century, the Rite of Spring and Walton 1. I'm sure plenty of people here know Walton's First Symphony. Those are the pieces I wanted to be a percussion player for. And once I'd done them both, I thought, right, okay, I'll go and play the piano now. No, I'm sorry to. I'm sorry to talk too much. I'm very difficult to shut up. I'm sorry.
No, but it is really fascinating because I don't think there are many pianists who have played the timpani part in the orchestra and then who also plays the piano part.
In this piece?
Yes, maybe, in the piece. So certainly I haven't done that. And but it's.
We'll have to arrange it. You could do the timpani part now.
Well, yes, that would be good. But it's very interesting how the personalities differ between Stravinsky and Debussy, although those two pieces were written within a few years. Debussy, I play a lot of Debussy, and when I came across a piece like this is one of the last pieces that he ever wrote. And then, we just think about a girl with flaxen hair and Claire de Lune and things like this. And then suddenly, it is much more complex than you think. And the ideas are it's just floods of different ideas, and he just puts everything together. In some ways, that the way that he coordinates two pianos within those three composers today, the Debussy is the most quietly outrageous to me. Yes, because Peter and I will be playing completely different things, and then suddenly we have to play exactly the same thing, and then we both go far apart. But then in the score, that's what it looks like to me. But at the same time, we are actually making the same music in the same piece. It's a genius writing, I feel.
Yeah. Well, there's a very special sound that Debussy imagined, I suppose, of when the piano is playing very simply, when both pianos are playing exactly the same notes, which of course is, from the point of view of playing together, extremely difficult, very demanding. But and as long as we are together, you will be able to appreciate the sound that Debussy was looking at. And it's very hard to say why, but the pianos obviously resonate with each other, and it's a magical sound. Well, everything about Debussy was magical. One of the greatest composers of all time, I think.
Yes, well, and then it has got this kind of almost a fluid kind of texture. Although this piece has got a little bit of brutal bits, but still there's very kind of Debussy flow. Versus the Stravinsky, which is, how do I call it? Very hefty, strong accents, different meters, different beats.
Savage.
Yes.
Very, very savage harmonies and so on. Yeah. But very sophisticated at the same time, seems to me.
Yes, very sophisticated.
But I mean, when you think about Debussy's life, I think he died in 1918, so that was the end of the First World War, and he died of cancer. And so when he wrote this, which I think was in, three years before, something like that, he was probably not in a very good state at all.
No,
and
he wasn't.
Apart from the war, and the French involvement in the war, and the clouds that were gathering everywhere, nobody had any idea what the future would hold then. The idea that there would never be another world war was a very potent one, because there was. But they didn't know there was going to be, did they, at the time? They just thought it was like the end of the world. It was just horrendous, I'm sure. And Debussy reflected that.
Yes, there's a lot of sadness in this piece, although Debussy does not use this kind of tearful, romantic melody anywhere, but then it's just this sadness that he carried permeates.
Yes, it's ambiguous. Yeah.
Yeah,
Unlike Rachmaninov, which is so sad and so dramatic and so obviously the end of his life, and maybe his greatest work, maybe, or one of them certainly. But yes, the sadness that shows through that is just absolutely heart on sleeve, which of course is very Russian to be like that, and not French, although maybe more than British, but that's another story, or Japanese.
But yeah, definitely in Rachmaninoff. But then again, this writing, every chord is so well thought through, incredibly sophisticated. I do play, Rachmaninoff other suites that Rachmaninoff wrote for two pianos, and they are also beautiful and very massive and everything. But this one, the symphonic dances, he played. He wrote for two pianos first, didn't he?
Same as where Stravinsky.
Yeah, and every bar has got some kind of accidentals, and every chord is different. When I first learned it, I learned for the concert that I played with Peter, and then Peter very kindly said, "Oh, let's rehearse maybe 2-3 months before the concert." Thank goodness we did that. That's a few years back, because when I opened the music, it does not look too bad. But then when I started playing, I thought, my goodness, because every chord is different.
It's not based on logic.
No,
in the way that some German music is.
Other Rachmaninoff, like Suite Number 2, it's very, very difficult. But lots of repeat chords. But this one, it's all the time like this, and then it really that makes it all the sound very rich, and then on top of it, or underneath this tearful Russian melody that it makes him he must have been feeling so lonely not being able to go back and, things like that. And then he thought that this piece was going to be his last work. And it
was.
became.
Was it? Yes, he knew as he was writing it, I'm sure. And the famous chant of the Dies Irae, which at first appeared in classical music, probably in the Symphonie Fantastique, didn't it, of Berlioz. But Rachmaninov adopted it, and it constantly comes in most of his major works. In this one, more than any, probably. You hear the Dies Irae, the day of wrath, the end of life, and all. It comes so much. But what I find really interesting about the end of Rachmaninoff's life is that, he was a member of the aristocracy in Russia, and therefore he had to flee when the Soviet Revolution happened. And he left the country with no money or anything and made his living from that point onwards as a performer, mainly, as a great pianist, one of the greatest in history, I think. So from Etude Tableau Opus 39, which was the last piece he wrote in Russia, to Opus 40, which was the fourth piano concerto, there was a 15-year gap or something like that with no compositions. By the time he came back to composing, he'd absorbed influences from the US and Europe and all over the place that he hadn't really absorbed before. And you hear jazz, you hear quite a lot of Gershwin type of harmony comes into it. You certainly hear Stravinsky. You hear all kinds of things in those last 5 pieces, which are fourth piano concerto, Corelli variations, Paganini Rhapsody, very popular, of course, a third symphony, and the symphonic dances. Did I miss one out?
No.
5 pieces were in his post-Russian period. And I absolutely adore all these music, but those 5, maybe more than any, just unbelievable originality and incredibly emotional. At the same time as which, what was going on around him? Schoenberg and Messiaen and all kinds of unbelievably revolutionary modernistic composers, and he stuck to tonality without ever being unoriginal, and was trashed for it, by the way, by the critics. In particular, this piece, I think it was completely slammed when it was written, and he just ignored that, and then died. That wasn't meant to be facetious, but it was the last piece that he wrote, and he just went. And I think it's probably 30 years before people really began to appreciate how great he was as a composer, how original. Just because he was popular, there was a tendency to think that he wasn't great, which is a very obtuse way of looking at things, but it does happen a lot, doesn't it? I'm sorry, I'm talking too much again.
No, but it really does. It does happen in piano composers. We are not playing any Liszt, but Liszt at one period it was almost like a dirty word, And then Rachmaninoff also, says, "Oh, do you like Rachmaninoff?" and like this. But actually, we cannot name anybody else who writes like Rachmaninoff. Each piece, you can identify his style, and yet each piece is different. He's sometimes, over romantic, but why not? We do need music to cry with. And sometimes he can be so dark. And that's the kind of darkness that I'm very interested in, where it comes from. And that darkness actually appears quite a lot in symphonic dances, I feel.
All the time, I think. Yes. So the second movement is like a danse macabre, isn't it?
Yes.
First movement, it's got this incredibly beautiful middle section. That's in the orchestral version. The melody is played on a saxophone in a very sad way. It's a very original idea. But it doesn't really matter what instrument it's on. It sounds so incredibly beautiful and nostalgic. That's the main thing. It's nostalgia for old Russia, probably, more than anything. If you were a member of the aristocracy, it was all very well to look back at old Russia, because they were the ones who could survive.
Maybe we should talk about how we came to play together, because we, is that from your microphone, this kind of some scratchy noise?
Yes.
I think so.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Think maybe you might like to.
Yes, it's my microphone scraping on my stubble.
That's right.
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Because Peter plays 2 pianos very, very often with Martin Ruska, of course. And so that's how I knew, as a piano duo, I saw many brochures and listening to radio and broadcasts and things like that. But then it was at Cheatham's summer school, international summer school and festival for pianists 1 year. We were going, Peter and Martin were going to do a kind of gala concert in a cabaret evening. And Martin said that he had very bad headache, and then he'd rather not play that evening. He felt that he really needed to rest. And I just walked past in a canteen, and Peter and Martin stopped me, and Martin said, "Oh, do you think you want to play with Peter?" And that's how it started. So we had a kind of trial session then. Mm. And so that's how we started. We do not play too many concerts all the time, but because we are busy individually. But when we play together, we enjoy very, very much. I hope you do.
Well, it's fantastic, actually. It's what I remember about, and I don't even remember the exact context of that first concert, really. But what I do remember is not having any idea what it would be like until we just sat down together. Basically, we had no rehearsal time. And we just sat down to play. And I think it was the Planets.
Yes, the Planets.
That we did. Oh, 2 movements from the Planets, something like that. And I wondered whether it would be together or not, and it was. First time through. It was absolutely without effort from that point of view. And I thought, we've got something going. We're onto something here. And it became a very, I think, very successful duo. Admittedly, not many concerts so far, but it's been wonderful. Mm-hmm. Fantastic working with you, because you're very, you're unbelievably easy to play with.
Oh, thank you.
And then we both, I think, instinctively know when one is dominant over the other in the music, and when it reverses. And it just happens. We don't have to discuss it. It's just obvious from the music to both of us. So that's how it works so well. It's amazing. I mean, this is a trade secret, but it's not going to be in a moment. We haven't rehearsed this a lot. You might think that we'd be doing it for weeks on end. Hopefully it'll sound that way, but it's not the case. It's like this afternoon and a rehearsal about a week ago, and that wasn't a very long one.
No.
And it will still be wonderful. Said he modestly.
But Rite of Spring, actually I've played that piece with other pianists, and I always played primo part, which occupies higher part of the keyboard. And then, but then this time I am playing the lower part of the keyboard, because once I turn the pages for Martin playing the secondo part and Peter playing the primo part, that's the top part, and it was a magnificent performance. I got lost when I was turning, because I just started to listen, because it was just incredible. Because Peter, having played in the orchestra, Peter knows how orchestra version goes, so he adds some sparkly notes here and there. And sometimes when I have to really go down and then do this kind of really hefty chords, Peter also helps me with that, which you can't do with piano duet. You need 2 pianos to do it. So, it's going to be extra colorful in some ways that you might think that, oh, well, it might be less interesting because only 2 pianos, but actually there are more, in some ways, more colors, and then we can be so tightly together because we are not 100 players, but only 2. But then we can actually manipulate a lot of colors and timing, and we can be really quite tightly together. So hopefully it is going to come across that way.
Well, as you say, it is, of course, in some parts of it, particularly the slower parts, the colours of an orchestra are in one's mind. If we know the piece in the first place, then they're there. And maybe you miss that a little bit in the quieter moments, but there aren't many quiet moments in the Rite of Spring.
No.
And in the quicker and more explosive dances, there is, in some ways, there's more excitement and more power from 2 pianos than from a very sophisticated orchestra. That's one of the interesting things about the orchestra version, is that he wrote it quite definitely to stretch the orchestra, to make particularly certain solos, including the opening bassoon solo, to sound like an unbelievable strain by writing notes that they would never have before been required to play. And of course, as the orchestras become more and more sophisticated in the 20th century, it became easier to play it. And so it actually sounds much less of an effort now than it used to. On the piano, we'll make it sound like an effort.
Yes, so, what I have to be careful is that, when Peter does something really extra, it's so much fun that sometimes I get a giggle.
It's the best excuse for wrong notes I've ever heard, though.
Because it's so much fun. And, I just start, it's almost like a giggle, yeah. So, I will try my best to look straight and serious in the concert.
I must tell you a little story, which I think maybe I've told you before, but it was probably about 10 years ago or something. I was playing a couple of concerts in a town called Yekaterinburg in the Ural district of Russia. It's one of the bigger cities in the eastern areas. And I was there for a long time because I also went out of town to do a few recitals. And that long period was over the break into spring. So when I arrived, it was unbelievably cold. After a few days, the icicles were starting to melt and it was dripping on the floor, and then they would break off and land, crash on the ground and everything like that. And by the time I left, it was spring. All the ice had gone. And in between whiles, I was in the hotel one day and I thought there was an earthquake. The cracking of the ice was so loud and there was so much vibration, I really did think there was an earthquake. And that's what the Russian spring means to the Russians, as opposed to our spring, which is basically the same as winter and summer, isn't it? But in Russia, it's a rather different matter. It's the beginning of this unbelievable period of growth and incredible agriculture and so on. And so, of course, in ancient Russia, they regarded spring as a god, which is really what's behind this piece, of course. And of course, until you think about it, the Rite of Spring seems to be just a very exciting virtuoso orchestral work with a lot of revolutionary harmony and rhythm in it. And very exciting it is for that. Very seminal, in fact. But when you start thinking about the Russian attitude to spring, it opens a new dimension. And I think that's just fantastic. I'm so glad I experienced it. I never did at any other time. I've been there a lot, but I never experienced the spring happening in that way. When you think of the opening bassoon solo being the appearance of a flower with the cracking of the ice, and therefore heralding summer, which of course is quite hot actually in most of Russia, and then all these insects and other flowers and trees and everything all suddenly bursting into life, which is what the opening represents, and then the dances, the sacrifice of a young girl, which of course is atrocious and appalling, but that's what they did at that time, which is what it's all about. I just find it makes shivers go down my spine to think about it, that the way that those people would have regarded spring in the ancient times, we can't imagine really, because it was so special.
Very powerful.
Is it time to finish?
I think so.
Okay, well, thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.